Hey everybody, this is Dust for Dusted on Gaming here on YouTube with a deck tech for the next deck we're probably going to be working on a little bit. Bant Eldrazi. So Bant Eldrazi has been a deck that has kind of faded into the background. It's still a very powerful deck, but as other Eldrazi menaces have stepped forward, such as first it was Eldrazi Tron, then it was Red-Green Eldrazi, and then the colorless Eldrazi decks. This deck's kind of been left by the wayside, and formation of things like Death Shadow, etc. So, what made Bant Eldrazi special? Bant Eldrazi is pretty good in creature brawl matchups. It's good in formats where Reality Smasher and Thought Knot Seer early are pretty good. It's not the greatest at attrition matchups. It can struggle against Blue-White X control. It can struggle against combo or linear strategies. So how do you combat that? The advantage of Eldrazi is fast mana. Noble Hierarchs, Eldrazi Temples. This particular build that I'm looking at plays one Gemstone Cavern for on the draw. So this deck is trying to, play a 3-drop on turn 2, a 4-drop on turn 3, a 5-drop on turn 4, or in the most busted scenarios, even faster. So one of the things this deck has struggled with is the controlling matchups. To try to combat that a little bit, I've included Nissa Steward of Elements. Now, Nissa has seen a card that has not seen a ton of play in Standard, has not seen much play in Modern, but it is basically a 3-mana Planeswalker. And obviously this Grot 2 ability is pretty relevant in a deck that has a lot of air and some really heavy hitters. The 0 ability lets you flip either a creature or land into play. Okay, so if you're looking at this list, 24 lands, 24 creatures. So there's 48 spells in the main deck alone that you can flip into play off of Nissa. The only cards you cannot are the Path to Exiles and Ancient Stirrings, the Nissas, and the Engineered Explosives. Now, this number can go down in post-board games. A lot of the sideboard stuff is non-creature, non-land stuff because you need to be able to interact with different strategies. But so Nissa here is kind of a hedge. I've been doing a lot of gold fishing testing with her. She seems very promising as both a mid-game card advantage engine and mid-game selection engine, as well as an alternative kill con where you can dome your opponent for 10 out of nowhere with 2 flying lands. Beyond that, the differences between the various types. Got Eldrazi Sky Spawner and Eldrazi Displacer as your 3 drops. I do not run Matter Shaper. Some lists run a split on Matter Shaper and such. That is a conscious choice on my part. I know it's a little bit tougher on the mana, but Sky Spawner is another form of acceleration. Like you can go turn 1 Noble Hierarch, turn 2 Eldrazi Sky Spawner, turn 3, acceleration from this, acceleration from that, play a turn 3 Reality Smasher without having Eldrazi Temple in the discussion. Also, the Scions play well with Drowner of Hope. So Drowner of Hope is this deck's... This and Eldrazi Displacer are this deck's big trump cards in creature matchups. Drowner of Hope allows you to tap down creatures, and Eldrazi Displacer allows you to flicker your Thought Knots, your Drowner of Hopes, your Eldrazi Sky Spawners for various forms of damage. Also, you can blink out your opponent's blockers, like Tarmogoyfs or Death Shadows and stuff, and just punk them out of nowhere. As far as interaction, this deck has 4 Path to Exile and 2 Engineer Explosives in the main. In other formats, like when Death Shadow has been the heavy hitter, I've also included a couple copies of Dismember, as opposed to these Nissas. But I think at this point in time, I'm going to try the Nissas for now. We might go back to Dismembers in the main or the side. But Nissas also pair well with the other Planeswalker in the sideboard for the grindy, control-ish matchups. And that is Tamiyo Field Researcher. So Tamiyo, obviously, +1 ability on creatures. You can plus it on your opponent's creatures, discourage them from attacking Tamiyo. You can plus them on your own creatures, get in for some damage. Importantly, this ability is when it deals combat damage. Period. It doesn't have to be, to a player. So this allows you to accrue card advantage. The -2, you can tap down a couple of your opponent's creatures, smash in. So Tamiyo is both good in terms of card advantage and in tempo battles. So against things like Tarmogoyfs or Scavenging Uses, that kind of stuff, or even the Eldrazi Mirror Match where your opponent doesn't have a Reality Smasher or an Obligator, this can be a pretty tide-turning card. And then obviously the ultimate is Omniscience plus draw 3 cards. So if you're able to hit a couple of spells off of that, that can be kind of game-breaking in of itself. So the thing about this deck is it's vulnerable to decks like Burn, vulnerable to Storm, vulnerable to, Tron. It's vulnerable to a lot of different, archetypes, a lot of different problems. So that's been one of the big hallmarks and struggles of the Eldrazi Tron matchup. The sideboard tries to be as balanced as I can, given the 3 colors that I have access to. I now have, I feel, enough cards in the Blue-White X matchup that the matchup's probably okay now. The Unified Wills and the Tamiyos to pair with the Nisses in the main deck give you a lot of edge against the Blue-White X control decks, not named probably just Guy. And then as far as the rest of the cards in the sideboard, Grafdigger's Cage, pretty good against graveyard decks, Galactic Company decks, Court of Calling decks. All of those decks can give you fits, like the Elves decks, the Devoted Druid combo decks, especially the Infinite Life version, can give you some problems, so Cage kind of helps shut down some of that. Rest in Peace also helps against graveyard strategies, which are a problem. Decks like Dredge, decks like Hollow One, all of those various strategies, being able to bring in these 4 cards can be pretty key in those matchups. Also can double as hate against Storm, which obviously is not a great matchup. So these 4, and then the 2 Unified Wills are pretty decent against Storm. So you have like 6 cards you can bring in against Storm now. Blessed Alliance, mainly here for burn, but also doubles if there's still any Death Shadow in your particular meta. Also, between this and the copies of Engineered Explosives in the main, you have a pretty decent amount of hate against Boggles if they don't have Leyline of Sanctity. Like, you can make them sack their attacking creatures, and then Engineer Explosives on 1 obviously is pretty good against Boggles. And then Stony Silence, this is solely here for Affinity and Lantern, both of which are horrible matchups. I've previously only ran 2. And it's kind of a nombo when you're running Engineered Explosives, but I'm finding that you need these or this to combat the early wave, and then your big creatures like Drowner of Hope and stuff can take over against Affinity. One of their big heavy hitters is Edge Champion, and your deck being colors completely blanks that. So if you can shut down the early like Arcbound Ravager or Cranial Plating shenanigans with like a Stony Silence, then you're usually in pretty good shape to be able to beat them in a longer game, much like Blue-White Eldrazi used to do when Eldrazi Wonder was a thing. And then finally, a couple copies of Worship. This card is great in a lot of creature-based matchups. There are very few creature-based decks that can entirely deal with your board, like Bant Nightfall, or even to a certain extent Death Shadow has problems sometimes killing Reality Smashers and Drowner of Hopes, and all of your various Scions and such. So Worship is a very great hedge card against those matchups. It's also decent against Burn, although sometimes it's hard to get 2 or 3 creatures down, then a Worship before Burn's pressuring you to kill you. So these 4 are pretty decent against Burn. I'm not bringing in Unified Will against Burn because counter spells are decent against Burn once you take control of the game, but your biggest thing is to just try to run them down, try to beat them down, try to race. A little bit of life gain here, or just preventing yourself from dying, both of which are hugely relevant in that matchup. And thought, like a turn 2 or turn 3 Thought Seer against burn is usually pretty good. So between all these tools, I think this is a pretty well balanced version of Bant Eldrazi against most of the field. We're going to run it through probably some fairly extensive testing, because I need to have a good secondary deck for Grand Prix Columbus for the side events, and starting for Season 2 of the qualifying here at a local game store. So I want to have a backup deck that I'm not always stuck on just playing burn. I mean, burn is an excellent choice, but I want to have a backup deck that I can hang in the firefight, so to speak. So this has been Dust for Dust Till Dawn Gaming with our deck tech on the Bant Eldrazi deck. We're going to be starting on testing. Thanks everyone for tuning in.